Hi everyone, in this part I'd like to go over how to define matrices and how to use vectors in Sage. So idea is first you write down a list, usual the list thing that you have learned recently, and then we're going to change that to vector, so it's going to change to a column vector. So I define these two lists 1, 2, 3 and 2, 3, 4 like this. Then you can use this command vector of the list. Then it's going to turn that list into a vector, and this one also into a vector and store it as a v1 and v2. So let me compare these two things. L1 and L2 were lists before. If you add these two lists, they just concatenate these two lists. So 1, 2, 3 and 2, 3, 4 connected. Kind of append those lists in here. Now v1 and v2 is converted to a vector. So if you add these two as a vector, x component and y component and z component adds give you 3 and 5 and 7. So that's a vector versus a list. And this is the different meaning of operation on those lists and the vectors. For example, if you do 3 times v1 minus 2 times v2 is a vector, so it'll go through the linear combination of the vectors that you know. But if you do that with L1 and L2, and L1 will be repeated 3 times, so it's going to be length 9 list, and it's going to be repeated 2 times. I don't know what this. I don't think the negative will be properly defined, so it might you may get an error message out of that. But with the vectors, you can put any real numbers in as a scalar multiplication in front of vectors. So let me introduce how to handle the matrix. First, we're going to define, just like the list before, we're going to define a list in here. Matrices, you can see, have rows. So first you have to enter the rows as a list like this, and a comma in the second row as a second entry of a bigger outer nested list in here. So you can see it's a double bracket in there. This is a first row, and this is the second row. And if you have a third row, you can keep entering by separated by comma here. But the beginning and end must have an additional bracket in there. So this is just a list right now to Sage. So each entry is a list of another things. Now that's stored as a small multiple list. Then if you use this command matrix, and it's going to turn this one into a matrix, and I call that small m. So I'm going to display that matrix, and you know the matrix multiplication. So if you multiply to itself, it's going to be another 2 by 2 matrix. And if you do that, you have 1, 2, 3, 4 displayed as a matrix, and if you multiply to itself, you have 7, 10, and 15, and 22 as an entry. So that's how you type those entrances. And if the matrices are big and you have to type in a lot of things, or if you know how to generate each of these entry, you can write it like this. You can generate using the formulas. First, inside row, so we start with the bracket and end it here. So let me highlight it. This part is a row. We're not typing those in, but we're using the formula. The rows, J is indices for rows, and indices within a row. So J is varying from 1 to 4. So K is the index for a row, and J is index for a column. Sorry about that. So for fixed K here, J is varying, which is like 1 and 2 in here. And it's going to give you this number, 0 and 0.1 and 0.2 and 0.3. As you change this J in here, you can see J divided by 10. That's the decimal places is changing. The K is not changing. K is starting from 0 out there. And when K is out there, if you can see the double bracket in here, so when K is 1, then this is going to be the second row in here, the generating. K is fixed 1, and J is changing now from 0 to 4, so you can see 1 and 1.1 as you plug in different values of J here. So that would be more automated way of generating a matrix if you know the patterns of the entries. But if it's not too big, it's small, you can just simply type in like this and turn it into a matrix. So for that 4 by 4 sides, and that was a list before I turned it into a matrix, so M will be the matrix with that 0 and 0.1 and 0.2 and 0.3, 1.1 and 1.2 and 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and so on. If you multiply that matrix 3 times to itself, and it turns out this is the result. So you can do the matrix multiplication after you turn that into a matrix. Now, matrix and a column vector, we want to multiply those things. So here's one example. Now, 1, 1, 1 is a list, but if you put a vector in there, it's going to become a column vector. Right now, it reads like a row vector, but if you multiply to the right, and it'll interpret as a column vector. If you multiply to the left, and the Sage will interpret the row vector. That's the only way you can make sense out of matrix multiplication. So if it is on the right, it's going to look at it as a 1, 1, 1 column vector. So you can see if you multiply 1, 1, 1 to the third power of m here, 1, 1, 1, the sum will appear as a 40. Okay, that's roughly 40. And if you add 1, 1, 1, it turns out it's adding all these numbers, and it turns out it's 220, and so on. So that's the vector. And you have the standard command like a transpose or inverse and things like that, and they're available.